The soil sampler beeped its completion, just as Jake Morrison's knee decided to remind him that 42 was too old to be crawling around alien dirt for 8 hours straight. He groaned, pushing himself up from the crystalline ground of Kepler 442b, and brushed the iridescent dust from his environmental suit. The stuff glowed faintly in the perpetual twilight of this world, which made everything look like a disco had exploded in a geology lab. "Sample collection complete," he muttered into his comm unit, more out of habit than necessity. The automated systems had already logged his progress, filed his reports, and probably ordered his coffee for when he returned to base. Technology was wonderful until it made you feel obsolete. Jake secured the sample containers in his field pack, each one carefully sealed and labeled according to protocols that seemed to multiply every time Earth Command updated their procedures. He joined the xenobiology program to study alien life forms, not to become the universe's most overqualified dirt collector. But here he was, 3 months into his assignment on humanity's newest colony world, spending more time analyzing mineral compositions than discovering the wonders of extraterrestrial biology. The irony wasn't lost on him that humanity's first major colony had turned out to be remarkably similar to Earth, at least in terms of basic chemistry and atmospheric composition. Sure, the gravity was about 15% lighter. The day cycle ran 28 hours instead of 24. And the local flora had an annoying tendency to change colors based on electromagnetic fluctuations in the planet's dual magnetic field. But overall, Kepler 442b felt like Earth's slightly eccentric cousin rather than a truly alien world. Jake began the trek back toward the research station, his boots crunching on the peculiar hybrid of sand and crystal fragments that seemed to cover most of the planet's surface. The sound always reminded him of walking on broken glass, except this glass occasionally pulsed with bioluminescent energy. The local scientists had theories about the phenomenon involving subsurface organisms, but Jake had yet to encounter any life more complex than the equivalent of bacterial mats. That was about to change. The first indication something was wrong came from his proximity sensors. The device, clipped to his belt and designed to detect movement within a 50-meter radius, started chirping in an erratic pattern Jake had never heard before. He paused, checking the readout. The screen showed a contact approximately 30 meters to his northeast, but the signal kept fluctuating between detection and absence, as if whatever was out there was phasing in and out of existence. "Probably another sensor malfunction," Jake said to nobody in particular, though he found himself checking his sidearm anyway. The research station's automated defense grid had been acting up lately, occasionally targeting indigenous wildlife that registered as potential threats. Command had assured everyone the bugs were being worked out, but Jake had learned to trust his equipment about as far as he could throw it in this reduced gravity. The chirping intensified as Jake moved toward the contact. Through the perpetual haze that passed for atmosphere on this world, he could make out what looked like a small crater, roughly circular and maybe 3 meters across. The edges were still smoking, which suggested something had impacted recently and with considerable force. Jake approached cautiously, his scientific curiosity warring with his survival instincts. The smart thing would be to mark the location and call it in. Let the specialists handle whatever had crashed out here. But the smart thing rarely made for interesting discoveries, and Jake had been having a disturbingly short supply of those lately. As he drew closer, the smoke cleared enough for him to see into the crater. What he found there made him forget every protocol he'd ever memorized. A child lay crumpled at the bottom of the impact site, small and fragile-looking, with silver fluid seeping from multiple wounds. The child appeared essentially human, except for ears that came to distinct points, like something out of an old fantasy novel. The silver fluid Jake realized was blood, though it seemed to shimmer with an inner light that suggested a biochemistry far more complex than anything in Earth's evolutionary tree. Jake's mind raced through the implications. First contact protocols demanded he immediately report any encounter with indigenous intelligent life. But those protocols assumed a controlled environment, diplomatic preparations, and definitely not finding injured children bleeding out in craters. The child's breathing was shallow and rapid, visible even through what appeared to be some kind of form-fitting garment that might have been clothing, or might have been a sophisticated environmental suit. Jake couldn't tell where the fabric ended and the child's skin began, which raised fascinating questions about textile technology that seemed entirely inappropriate to consider while someone was dying in front of him. "Okay, Morrison," Jake said aloud, dropping his field pack and activating his emergency medical kit. "You wanted to study alien biology. Here's your chance to get hands-on experience." He slid down into the crater, trying to assess the child's condition with his limited medical training. The wounds appeared to be energy burns rather than physical trauma, which suggested the child had been caught in some kind of weapon discharge. The automated defense grid, perhaps, though Jake couldn't imagine what had triggered it to target something so obviously harmless. The emergency kit contained basic medical supplies designed for human physiology, but Jake figured trauma response principles probably translated across species. Stop the bleeding, maintain the airway, prevent shock, and try not to make things worse. The silver blood posed a challenge, though. Jake had no idea if standard coagulants would work, or if they might prove toxic to alien biochemistry. As he worked, Jake noticed something odd about the child's breathing. The rhythm seemed wrong for distress, too regular and controlled, almost like meditation breathing. Then he felt it, a gentle pressure in his mind like someone lightly touching his thoughts. Not invasive or threatening, more like a tentative question. The sensation brought with it emotions that weren't his own. Fear, yes, but also curiosity and something that felt remarkably like gratitude. Jake realized the child was somehow communicating empathically, projecting feelings and simple concepts rather than words. "Well, that's new," Jake muttered, applying a sterile bandage to what looked like the most serious wound. "And here I thought universal translators were the stuff of fiction." The empathic contact strengthened as Jake continued his makeshift medical care. Through it, he sensed the child's confusion about Jake's actions, followed by growing trust as the child realized Jake was trying to help rather than harm. There was something else, too, a sense of recognition that puzzled Jake until he understood it came with the knowledge that his willingness to aid a complete stranger was somehow significant in the child's cultural context. Jake's proximity sensors began chirping again, this time detecting multiple contacts approaching fast. The child's emotional projection shifted to urgent warning, accompanied by concepts Jake interpreted as family and searching and something that might have meant important person. "Okay, kid," Jake said, carefully lifting the child from the crater. "Looks like your people are coming. Let's hope they're feeling friendly when they get here." The child weighed almost nothing in the reduced gravity, but Jake could feel the alien physiology responding to his movements, adjusting balance and muscle tension in ways that suggested a more integrated nervous system than humans possessed. The empathic connection provided a running commentary on the child's condition, letting Jake know which positions caused pain and which provided relief. By the time the search party crested the nearby ridge, Jake had the child stabilized as best he could manage and was trying to figure out how to explain this situation to people who probably didn't speak any Earth languages. The approaching figures were clearly adults of the same species, tall and graceful with the same pointed ears, and what appeared to be bioluminescent markings along their exposed skin. The leader of the group stood nearly 2 meters tall, with intricate patterns of light playing across her features in what Jake suspected was some form of emotional or social communication. Her bearing suggested authority, and the way the others deferred to her made it clear she held significant rank in whatever social structure these people maintained. Jake raised his free hand in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peaceful intent, while keeping his other arm securely around the injured child. The empathic connection had faded as the child lost consciousness, but Jake could still sense a faint presence, like background music playing just below the threshold of perception. The leader approached slowly, her luminescent markings shifting through patterns Jake wished he could interpret. When she spoke, her voice carried musical qualities that suggested a language based more on tonal variation than the consonant-heavy structure of human speech. Jake tried basic English first, then Mandarin, then fell back on the kind of exaggerated gestures that made him feel like he was playing charades with the fate of interspecies relations. The child in his arms stirred weakly, and suddenly the empathic connection flared back to life, stronger than before. Through it came not just the child's sensations, but something else. An adult presence, vast and complex, examining Jake's thoughts with careful precision. The leader, he realized, was also empathically gifted, and was using the child as a conduit to understand Jake's intentions. The mental contact brought with it a flood of concepts and emotions. Gratitude, certainly, but also surprise and something that felt like recognition. Jake sensed that his actions had significance beyond simple first aid, that in this species culture, the willingness to risk oneself for an unknown child carried profound meaning. The leader stepped forward and gently touched Jake's forehead with one long finger. The empathic connection exploded into full communication, and suddenly Jake understood that he'd just become something these people had never encountered before. A protector from another species. Someone who had earned trust across biological boundaries. And judging by the complex emotional undercurrents flowing through the mental link, that was going to make his life significantly more complicated than simple soil sample collection. Jake's first attempt at interspecies diplomacy involved a lot of pointing at himself and saying, "Jake," very slowly, as if volume and repetition could bridge the gap between entirely different evolutionary trees. The leader of the search party watched this performance with what Jake hoped was patience rather than the kind of polite bewilderment reserved for particularly slow children. The empathic connection had stabilized into something Jake could only describe as emotional background music. He could sense the general mood of the group, picking up waves of concern for the injured child, curiosity about him, and something that felt remarkably like amusement at his linguistic efforts. Apparently, even alien species appreciated physical comedy. The leader stepped closer, her bioluminescent markings shifting through patterns that reminded Jake of aurora displays, if auroras could be programmed by someone with excellent taste in light shows. She placed her palm against her chest and spoke a word that sounded like wind chimes having a conversation with a flute. Then she gestured to Jake, tilting her head in what he recognized as a question, despite the pointed ears and luminescent skin. "Jake," he said again, tapping his chest. "I'm Jake Morrison, xenobiologist, terrible at first contact protocols, and apparently your species' newest emergency medic." The musical word came again, and this time Jake caught the empathic undertone that suggested it wasn't just a name but a title or position. Through the mental connection, concepts filtered through that he interpreted as authority, responsibility, and something that might have meant keeper of important things. "Keeper Eve," Jake said, taking a guess at pronunciation. The leader's markings brightened significantly, which Jake chose to interpret as approval rather than the alien equivalent of close enough for government work. The child stirred in Jake's arms, and immediately the group's attention focused with laser precision. Jake felt a wave of protective instinct wash over him through the empathic link, but it came with undertones of trust that suggested they recognized his care rather than seeing him as a threat. The child's eyes opened, revealing irises that seemed to contain tiny galaxies, complete with what looked like miniature spiral formations. "Okay, that's either the most beautiful thing I've ever seen or I'm having some kind of atmospheric poisoning hallucination," Jake muttered. "Either way, I'm calling it a win." The child's gaze fixed on Jake's face, and the empathic connection strengthened until Jake could sense specific thoughts rather than just general emotions. Gratitude, yes, but also recognition and something that felt like the mental equivalent of a small hand slipping into his. The child was claiming him as safe, marking him as trusted in whatever social framework these people used. Keeper Eth extended her arms toward the child, but paused when the little one's grip tightened on Jake's environmental suit. Through the empathic link came a complex exchange between adult and child that Jake could only partially follow. The child was insisting on something, projecting concepts of protection and belonging that seemed to center on Jake himself. "I think your kid has decided I'm part of the family now," Jake said to Keeper Eth. "I'm flattered, really, but I should probably mention that my experience with child care is limited to keeping my nephew from eating craft supplies." The exchange continued, with Keeper Eth's markings cycling through patterns Jake was beginning to recognize as the alien equivalent of parental negotiation. The child responded with their own light display, tiny bioluminescent patches along their arms pulsing in what looked like the most adorable alien tantrum Jake had ever witnessed. Finally, Keeper Eth turned to Jake and projected a complex question through the empathic link. Jake caught concepts of journey, safety, trust, and something that might have meant, "Would you be willing?" The child's grip on his suit tightened even more, and Jake realized they were asking him to accompany them back to wherever they'd come from. "Well," Jake said, "I suppose I could call in sick to work." The city's welcome committee consisted of approximately 24 Velter, who had apparently dropped whatever they were doing to come stare at the human carrying their leader's child. Jake felt like a zoo exhibit, except the zoo animals were the ones doing the examining, and they seemed genuinely fascinated by his inability to produce bioluminescent patterns. "I don't suppose anyone has a My First Alien Civilization guidebook," Jake said to Keeper Eth as they passed through what appeared to be an entrance that recognized them and dilated open like an organic iris. "Because I'm starting to think my cultural sensitivity training didn't cover enough scenarios." The child had woken up during their approach to the city and was now providing running commentary through the empathic link that Jake could only partially translate. Most of it seemed to be excited explanations about various people and places, delivered with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested either complete recovery from their injuries or the alien equivalent of a caffeine high. Inside the city, Jake discovered that Velter architecture followed principles that would have made his engineering professors weep with either joy or despair. The structures weren't built so much as cultivated, growing from some kind of biological foundation that could apparently be shaped and programmed like living software. The walls pulsed with data streams that Jake's enhanced pattern recognition was starting to identify as information networks rather than just pretty lights. "Okay, that's definitely not covered in standard construction codes," Jake muttered as they passed through a corridor that adjusted its dimensions to accommodate their group size. "I'm guessing your building inspectors have very different concerns than ours." Keeper Eth guided them into what Jake assumed was some kind of meeting chamber, though the space seemed to reconfigure itself as they entered, sprouting furniture-like formations from the floor that perfectly matched their individual heights and apparent comfort requirements. Jake found himself seated on something that felt like it was analyzing his skeletal structure and adjusting accordingly. "I could get used to this," Jake said, then immediately wondered if that was exactly what he should be worried about. "Though I'm guessing the maintenance requirements are a little more complex than changing light bulbs." The child had transferred their grip from Jake's environmental suit to his actual hand, apparently deciding that direct skin contact provided better empathic transmission. Through the enhanced connection, Jake began receiving what felt like a cultural orientation lecture, complete with concepts about Velter's social structure that his human brain kept trying to translate into familiar frameworks. What emerged was a picture of a society organized around demonstrated competence and earned trust, rather than inherited authority or accumulated wealth. Status came from what you could contribute to the group's survival and prosperity, and the highest positions were held by those who had proven their ability to make decisions that benefited everyone rather than just themselves. "So you're telling me you've solved politics," Jake said to the child, who responded with patterns of light that Jake was learning to interpret as laughter. "And here I thought that was impossible for any species with functioning brain cells." Keeper Eth began what Jake recognized as a formal presentation, her bioluminescent markings cycling through elaborate patterns while she spoke in the musical language Jake was slowly beginning to pick up. The empathic undertones provided translation that his conscious mind struggled to process, but the general meaning was clear enough. Jake's actions had triggered something significant in Velter culture, something that hadn't happened in living memory. The concept of protector's bond kept surfacing in the empathic exchange, carrying implications that stretched far beyond simple gratitude for medical assistance. Jake was beginning to understand that his willingness to risk himself for an unknown alien child had marked him as something unprecedented in Velter experience. They had protocols for dealing with other Velter who earned such trust, but no framework for extending it across species boundaries. "Let me guess," Jake said during a pause in Keeper Eve's presentation. "I've accidentally signed up for something that comes with a lot more responsibility than I bargained for." The child's empathic projection carried concepts of protection, belonging, and something that felt like permanent commitment. Jake realized that in their culture, the bond he'd formed wasn't temporary or conditional. By choosing to help when he could have walked away, he'd created a connection that their society considered as binding as genetics. "And here I thought the most complicated relationship I'd have to worry about was explaining my research reports to the bureaucrats back on Earth," Jake said. "Turns out interspecies adoption is significantly more complex." Keeper Eth continued her explanation, and Jake learned that the Velter were indeed refugees from a dying world, making difficult decisions about survival and adaptation in a hostile universe. Their biotechnology, which seemed almost magical, was actually the result of centuries of development driven by necessity. When your planet's ecosystem was collapsing, you learned to make every resource count, including the ability to interface directly with biological systems. "That's either the most impressive example of adaptive engineering I've ever encountered," Jake said, "or you folks have had a really rough few centuries." The empathic response carried overtones of loss and determination that answered Jake's question without words. The Velter had survived their world's death by becoming something new, integrating their technology with their biology in ways that allowed them to thrive in environments that would have killed their ancestors. But that adaptation had come at the cost of losing their original home and most of their population. Jake was still processing the implications when Keeper Eth approached him with what appeared to be a piece of living jewelry, a metallic band that moved like liquid mercury and pulsed with the same bioluminescent patterns as Velter skin. Through the empathic link came concepts of interface, enhancement, and choice. "I'm guessing this isn't just a fashion accessory," Jake said, holding up the band and watching it respond to his proximity by shifting through colors that seemed to match his emotional state. "And I'm also guessing there's no returns policy if I don't like the side effects." The child projected waves of encouragement and excitement, along with concepts that suggested the interface would allow Jake to fully participate in Velter society rather than remaining a permanent outsider. But the empathic undertones also carried warnings about the irreversible nature of the choice. Once integrated with Velter biotechnology, Jake would be changed in ways that might affect his ability to return to purely human existence. "Well," Jake said, looking at the eager face of the child who had somehow claimed him as family, then at Keeper Eth who was waiting for his decision with patience that felt like parental concern, I did join the xenobiology program to study alien life forms. I just didn't expect to become part of the study myself. He slipped the band around his wrist and immediately felt his nervous system respond to the new input. The empathic connection that had been limited to emotional overtones suddenly exploded into full sensory sharing. Jake could perceive the bioluminescent patterns of everyone in the room as clearly as if he'd been reading text, understand the complex harmonics of their speech as naturally as his native language, and sense the city around them as a living organism with needs and responses. "Okay," Jake said, his voice now carrying harmonics he'd never produced before. "That's definitely going to take some getting used to. I don't suppose this comes with an instruction manual written in small words and simple pictures." The child's laughter rippled through the enhanced empathic link like music, and Jake realized that his joke had been translated not just linguistically, but culturally, carrying implications about learning and adaptation that resonated with Velter humor. He'd accidentally made a cross-species pun, which probably qualified as some kind of first contact achievement. Keeper Eve's response came through the interface as fully formed concepts rather than translated words. Jake was now part of their community in ways that went beyond simple acceptance. The biotechnology would enhance his capabilities while preserving his essential humanity, creating a bridge between species that could serve as a foundation for genuine cooperation rather than mere coexistence. "So I'm basically a living diplomatic protocol," Jake said, flexing his fingers and watching the interface respond to his movements with ripples of light. "I always wondered what I'd do after retirement. Turns out the answer was, become the universe's first human-alien hybrid ambassador." Through the enhanced connection, Jake could sense the broader implications of his choice rippling through the Velter community. His willingness to accept their biotechnology represented a level of trust that went far beyond simple alliance. He'd committed to becoming something new, something that existed in the space between human and Velter cultures. "I don't suppose anyone's thought to mention this to Earth Command," Jake said, then immediately realized through the empathic link that Keeper Eth had been wondering the same thing. "Because I have a feeling my mission reports are about to get significantly more interesting to write." The child had curled up against Jake's side, apparently deciding that the interface made him even more satisfactory as a protector figure. Through the enhanced empathic connection, Jake could sense their complete trust and contentment, along with the knowledge that his decision had created ripples that would reshape both species' understanding of what was possible between different forms of intelligent life. "Next time I complain about my job being boring," Jake said, watching the bioluminescent patterns play across his enhanced skin, "somebody please remind me that I asked for this." The Earth diplomatic shuttle arrived 3 days after Jake had stopped being entirely human, which he supposed was either perfect timing or a cosmic joke, depending on how you looked at interspecies relations. He watched the ungainly vessel settle onto the landing platform the Velter had grown specifically for the occasion, and tried to figure out how to explain his situation to people who still thought alien contact would involve a lot more formal handshakes and a lot fewer biological modifications. "I don't suppose there's a standard diplomatic protocol for, 'Hi, I'm your advanced scout and I've accidentally become part of the species we're supposed to be negotiating with,'" Jake said to Keeper Eth, who responded with the Velter equivalent of sympathetic amusement. Through the enhanced empathic interface, Jake could sense the tension rippling through the Velter community as they prepared for formal first contact. Despite their advanced biotechnology and centuries of survival experience, they were just as nervous about this meeting as the humans probably were. The difference was that Jake could feel everyone's anxiety like background radiation, which made him appreciate why most species probably didn't evolve telepathic abilities. The child, who Jake had learned was named something that translated roughly to "star who dances between thoughts," had appointed themselves as Jake's personal cultural advisor, and was currently providing running commentary on everything the human delegation was doing wrong before they even left their shuttle. Apparently your people's approach vectors suggest either poor piloting skills or mild hostility, Jake said, translating the child's empathic observations. Also, the shuttle's electromagnetic signature is giving everyone a headache, and somebody wants to know if all human technology sounds like it's having an argument with itself. The delegation that emerged from the shuttle looked exactly like what Jake had expected. Senior diplomats in formal attire, military advisors trying to look non-threatening while obviously prepared for trouble, and scientists carrying enough portable equipment to stock a small laboratory. They moved with the kind of careful coordination that suggested months of preparation for a scenario that bore absolutely no resemblance to what they were actually walking into. Jake recognized the lead diplomat from orientation materials he'd studied back when his biggest concern was whether his soil samples were properly labeled. Dr. Sarah Chen, senior xenocultural specialist, author of 3 books on theoretical first contact protocols, and currently looking like someone who discovered that all her theories were about as useful as a chocolate teapot. Dr. Morrison, Dr. Chen said as Jake approached the delegation, her voice carrying the kind of professional warmth that diplomatic training probably required. Your preliminary reports were quite illuminating. I trust you've maintained appropriate observational distance during your extended contact period. Jake glanced down at his arms, where bioluminescent patterns were currently displaying his emotional state in colors that would have made a rainbow jealous. Then back at the delegation, whose expressions suggested they were rapidly recalculating everything they thought they knew about first contact procedures. About that, Jake said, I might have gotten a little more involved in the cultural exchange than the standard protocols recommend. But on the bright side, I can now provide real-time translation services, and I'm pretty sure I've figured out their legal system. Dr. Chen's smile took on the kind of strained quality that Jake associated with people trying very hard not to panic in public. Behind her, the military advisors were conducting the kind of rapid visual assessment that suggested they were trying to determine whether Jake was still technically human enough to trust. Perhaps, Dr. Chen said carefully, you could brief us on the current situation before we proceed with formal introductions. Jake looked at Keeper Eve, who was waiting nearby with the kind of patient dignity that suggested she was used to dealing with confused visitors who didn't understand local customs. Starhu Dance's between thoughts had attached themselves to Jake's leg and was projecting waves of curiosity about the new humans that felt like having an enthusiastic tour guide broadcasting directly into his brain. Well, Jake said, the good news is that they're peaceful, highly advanced, and genuinely interested in establishing positive relations with humanity. The less good news is that I've accidentally invoked some kind of sacred cultural protocol that makes me responsible for facilitating understanding between our species, and there might not be a way to undo that even if I wanted to. The empathic interface allowed Jake to sense the exact moment when Dr. Chen's professional composure shifted from diplomatic concern to genuine alarm. The military advisor's tension spiked sharply enough that Starhu Dance's between thoughts projected a question about whether the new humans were planning to fight someone. The biotechnological integration was voluntary, Jake added quickly, and completely reversible if it becomes necessary. Probably. The Velter aren't entirely sure because nobody's ever asked to undo it before, but they're willing to research the question if Earth Command insists. Dr. Chen exchanged glances with her team that Jake didn't need empathic abilities to interpret. They were facing a first contact scenario that had gone so far outside their prepared parameters that their backup plans probably didn't even cover the same galaxy. Dr. Morrison, Dr. Chen said, perhaps you could arrange an introduction to their leadership so we can begin establishing formal diplomatic relations. Jake gestured toward Keeper Eve, whose bioluminescent markings had shifted into patterns that Jake now recognized as formal greeting displays mixed with subtle humor about human social protocols. Dr. Chen, I'd like you to meet Keeper Eve, who is essentially the Velter equivalent of your entire diplomatic corps, scientific advisory board, and probably half of Earth's government rolled into one person. Keeper Eve, Dr. Chen represents Earth's official first contact delegation, and she's about to discover that everything humanity thought it